At family dinner, my father looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll never be anything more than a disappointment." My brothers laughed, my mother sipped her wine, and I just kept chewing my food because what I was about to do next didn't need defending. 2 weeks later, that same father lay in a hospital bed, unconscious, hooked up to machines, and the doctor stepped into the hallway, looked past my mother and my brothers, and said, "We'll need Judge Monroe's signature to proceed." Every head turned, every jaw dropped, and I didn't even flinch, because the title they thought I'd never earn had become the one they now desperately needed. Before I tell you exactly how I went from being the family punchline to the one holding all the legal power over my father's life, have you ever had to fight for your own voice? If you're yet to subscribe, hit that button. What happened next wasn't revenge, it was justice, served cold in a courtroom I built for myself. This isn't just a story about becoming a judge. It's about what happens when the family who called you nothing finds out you're the one who gets the final say. In our house, family dinners weren't about connection. They were ceremonies of performance. Everyone had a role. My father, the king at the head of the table. My mother, the loyal supporter. My two brothers, the golden heirs, one destined for business, the other for medicine. And me, I was the space filler, the quiet one. The girl with the attitude problem, because I asked questions no one wanted to answer. I sat at the table like a shadow, present but weightless. The fork in my hand clinked on a plate I never felt entitled to. That table taught me early that being born into a family didn't mean you belonged. I was 14 when I first realized my silence wasn't protection, it was erasure. My father praised my older brother for acing a math test while ignoring the poetry award I had tucked into my backpack. "Math is useful," he said, pouring himself another glass of wine. "Not like those emotional hobbies." My mother hummed in agreement, eyes fixed on the mashed potatoes she was scooping. I didn't say anything. I just swallowed my pride with my food and learned to stop sharing. By high school, I knew I was different, not in the way that made people special, but in the way that made them forgettable. My brothers were given tutors, internships, endless praise. I was told to focus on something realistic when I mentioned law school. "You're book smart," my father said, "but you don't have what it takes for that world." When I asked him what it did take, he smirked and said, "Thicker skin." So I stopped asking. I applied to college without their help. I wrote my personal statement at the kitchen table while my brothers debated where to hang their framed acceptance letters. I got into a solid state school with a pre-law track and a partial scholarship. My parents barely reacted. "We don't have much to give you," my mother said, as if it were a warning, not an apology. My father just nodded. "Well, you're on your own now. Time to see what you're really made of." That became the family anthem. You're on your own. They said it like a challenge, like a dismissal, like a death sentence. But I took it as a promise. While my brothers coasted on family favors and name recognition, I worked, I studied, I clerked, I took the LSAT while juggling 2 jobs and never once called home for help. They didn't check in, didn't visit, and when I got accepted into a top-tier law school on a full ride, I didn't tell them. Not out of spite, out of necessity. My success was safer in silence. The less they knew, the less they could ruin. I became a ghost to them by design. But what none of them realized was that the girl they once ignored had quietly been building the power they would one day beg for. And that day was coming. They called it tough love, but what they really meant was preference, cleverly disguised as parenting. At home, everything was a competition I hadn't entered but was expected to lose gracefully. My brothers didn't have to try to be celebrated, they just had to exist in the right way. Confident, loud, career-driven. I was quieter, more observant, and somehow that made me suspicious, aloof, not a team player. When I spoke, it was too much. When I stayed silent, I was moody. I learned quickly that there was no version of myself that would earn me what came so freely to them. My father liked winners, or at least people who looked like winners. My brothers played sports, so they were strong. They cracked jokes, so they were charming. They went into male-dominated fields, so they were going somewhere. Me? I liked debate. I liked rules and how they could be argued from both sides. I liked the truth even when it made people uncomfortable. None of that played well at dinner. I remember sitting at that table the year my brother got into Duke, and the entire meal was a celebration. Steak, wine, my father's famous garlic bread. Toasts were made. Stories were shared. Meanwhile, I'd just been awarded a competitive scholarship, one I'd earned on my own merit. I'd slid the letter across the table hoping for something. My dad didn't even pick it up. "Good for you," he muttered, already turning back to my brother's internship news. My mom said I should be grateful he even acknowledged it. "You know how he is," she whispered, like his indifference was a personality trait, not a choice. But the worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the way they'd weaponize my independence against me. Anytime I succeeded, they used it as proof they didn't need to support me. "You've always been the strong one," my mom would say. "We knew you'd be fine." That's how they justified the imbalance. They dressed favoritism up in the language of faith. And I let them. I let them because arguing only made it worse. So I played the long game. I kept my head down, let them believe I was just surviving when I was actually rising. They never asked about my GPA, so they didn't know it was perfect. They never asked where I was clerking, so they didn't know my mentor sat on the state Supreme Court. They never showed up for anything, so they never saw the nameplate on my desk, or the mock trials I won, or the judges who shook my hand after every argument like they already knew where I was headed. I let them see what they wanted to see, a quiet girl with average ambition, second place at best, a family afterthought, until the day their world cracked open and I wasn't the forgotten one anymore. I was the one they needed. Family dinners were a masterclass in humiliation, not the loud, obvious kind, the slow drip variety, a smirk here, a dismissive shrug there, micro-cuts disguised as jokes. "She's probably off writing one of her essays about us," my oldest brother would say, laughing as if mocking me was a group sport. My father would nod, chewing slowly, like even my presence required patience. I'd look up from my plate and meet a wall of blank stares, then look back down and remind myself to chew slower, blink less, breathe quieter. Survival, in that house, meant making yourself small enough that they'd forget you were in the room. Most nights it worked. But even in their cruelty, they taught me something. Every eye roll sharpened me. Every interrupted sentence built my restraint. Every time they laughed over something I cared about, I filed the moment away, studied it like case law. The way my mother would say, "Let the boys talk," whenever I tried to offer an opinion. The way my father would sigh when I brought up anything outside the safe territory of sports, politics, or his legacy. Every time I said something smart and they made a joke out of it, I learned that being right didn't matter. Being heard did. And that would come later, when I held the gavel. When I told them I was applying for law school, no one took it seriously. My father didn't even look up from his paper. "It's a good backup," he said, "for when real life doesn't work out." My brothers smirked, one of them muttering something about too much TV drama. My mother told me I should consider paralegal work just to be safe. I nodded, smiled even, because by then I'd stopped looking for their approval. I just wanted the receipts. I moved out the same week my acceptance letter came. They didn't help me pack, didn't ask which school. My father handed me $100 bill at the door like he was doing me a favor. "Don't waste it," he said. I didn't. I used it to buy the first textbook that taught me how to dismantle people like him, those who confuse authority with wisdom, control with care. They never visited, not once. I graduated magna cum laude without a single call from home, passed the bar on my first try, got appointed as a junior judge in the municipal court just before my 30th birthday. Still nothing. They didn't even know what city I lived in. But none of that surprised me. What did surprise me was how calm I felt watching it all unfold. No need to shout my success across a table that never fed me truth. I just sat back, quietly, steadily rising, until the day came when their laughter stopped, mid-sentence, mid-breath, because the daughter they said would never be anything had just been handed the final say. I walked across the stage with the kind of smile I used to fake at home. Except this time, it was real. Earned. There were no parents in the audience, no siblings clapping from the front row, no family dinner planned afterward, just me, in a row of black robes and bright futures, holding a diploma they never thought I'd earn. They didn't know I was graduating that week. They didn't even know I was in law school, and by then I preferred it that way. It wasn't just about protecting my peace. It was about building a life that couldn't be picked apart by people who had done nothing to help me build it. Every achievement I kept to myself became a shield. I learned that sharing my wins with the wrong people only gave them more to minimize, so I stopped giving them the chance. My classmates celebrated with champagne and families and flashbulbs. I went home, kicked off my heels, and hung the degree in a simple frame on a wall no one else had to see. There was no toast, no cake, no proud photo on the mantle, just quiet, and for once, I welcomed it, because this time, the silence wasn't neglect, it was choice. My phone buzzed that evening, a family group chat I rarely engaged with. My brother had gotten promoted. They were all going out to dinner. "You should come," my mother texted. "It'll be good for you to be around people doing big things." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I replied, "Can't. Have work." That wasn't a lie. I had already started clerking. Early, thanks to a professor who saw more in me than my entire family ever had. My days were filled with case briefs, judicial meetings, and lessons that would shape the way I carried a courtroom. My evenings were quiet, disciplined, deliberate. No one knew. Not because I was hiding, but because I was finished offering my life up for their dismissal. They thought I was drifting, falling behind. They imagined I worked a desk job, maybe temping, something small, something that matched the story they told themselves when they needed to feel better about the way they treated me. I let them believe it, because the bigger the gap between who they thought I was and who I really had become, the more powerful the reveal would be. And that reveal came sooner than I expected. Not in a robe, not in a courtroom, but in a hospital hallway, when a doctor made a call and asked for the person with legal power of attorney. And my name was the only one on the form. That was the day my family found out that the daughter they'd laughed at across the dinner table now had the authority to decide who got saved and who didn't. It was 2 months before the hospital call. We were at a family dinner, one of the rare times I agreed to show up, mostly out of politeness and a strange curiosity about whether anything had changed. It hadn't. Same table, same seating order, same smug dynamic that had always defined our conversations. The food was overcooked, the wine was cheap, and the laughter was sharp-edged. I tried to stay quiet, tried to let the evening pass like background noise, but they always found a way to draw blood with a smile. "Remember when Mac wanted to be a lawyer?" my brother said between bites of steak, grinning like it was an inside joke. "What was it, Judge Judy or something?" My other brother laughed. My father chuckled in that dismissive, low rumble that always made my stomach twist. "She thought she was going to change the world," he said. "Now look at her. What are you doing these days anyway, Mac? HR? Admin?" I smiled and took a sip of water, ignoring the heat in my throat. "Just working," I said. They nodded like that confirmed their assumptions. "Well, you've always been good at playing it safe," my mom added. "Not everyone's built for pressure." It wasn't a joke. It was a weapon disguised as banter. I wanted to scream, to tell them where I'd been, what I'd done, who had trusted me with rulings that shaped real lives. But I didn't, because they wouldn't have believed it, not until someone else told them it was true. That was the thing about my family. They only valued voices that echoed their own. So I let the insults settle, let their laughter roll right over me, and I quietly rehearsed the truth in my head. The bar exam scores, the courtroom clerkship, the nights I sat in chambers across from judges who respected me more than my own father ever had. The dinner went on. My brothers argued about stock portfolios. My mother complained about her HOA. My father offered unsolicited advice like he was handing out wisdom that could still shape our lives. No one noticed the silence coming from my side of the table. They thought it was compliance, but it was composure. Because while they were busy building a narrative around who I used to be, I was preparing to become someone who could dismantle their illusions in a single moment. And that moment came soon enough. On a sterile phone line in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when a hospital needed someone with authority to make a decision no one else was qualified to make. They thought I was the family disappointment. They didn't realize I was the one holding the pen. After that dinner, I didn't go home angry. I went home awake. Something inside me had clicked, not like a light bulb, but like a lock. I saw them clearly now. Not just as the family who underestimated me, but as the kind of people who needed someone to belittle in order to feel bigger. I used to wonder if I was being too sensitive, if maybe I was misreading the digs and sideways glances. But that night erased every doubt. They weren't being careless. They were being calculated. and I had finally stopped confusing proximity with connection. The next morning, I walked into chambers early, my robe over my arm, case files in hand, and a focus so sharp I could have sliced glass. The bailiff nodded to me like always. "Morning, Judge Monroe." I smiled. Still not used to the title, but earning it meant more knowing how many people assumed I never would. Later that day, I sat in my office, sipping coffee and reviewing motions when my phone rang. Unknown number, Boston area code. I almost ignored it, but instinct told me not to. I answered. A nurse spoke first, gentle and cautious, asking if I was Mackenzie Monroe. Then a pause. "I'm calling from Boston General. We have a patient here, Frank Monroe. He listed you as his medical proxy." Everything stilled. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. It was pure stillness, like I'd been expecting this moment all along. I didn't even ask how he was. Not yet. I just said, "Repeat that, please." "You're listed as his medical power of attorney. Are you available to speak with his physician?" I wasn't supposed to be. He never told me. I never signed anything, but I knew exactly what had happened. Years ago, during a health scare, I'd helped him fill out his legal forms. He was panicking. He didn't want my brothers to see him that vulnerable. "You're the calm one," he'd said. "Just sign here. It's just in case." I hadn't thought about it since. Until now, they didn't know. None of them. But the hospital did, and so did the attending physician, who came on the line next. "Judge Monroe," he began, formal and respectful. "Your father is in critical condition. We need consent for treatment. You're the legal authority." That's when it hit me. All the dinners, the jokes, the smirks, they meant nothing now. They could laugh at my dreams all they wanted, but when it came time to make real decisions, they had to wait for the one they thought would never amount to anything. I gave the doctor permission for the procedure, calm, professional, detached. Then I hung up and sat in silence, not out of shock, but out of satisfaction. The same father who once told me I wasn't cut out for pressure had just put his life in my hands. And suddenly the punchline wasn't funny anymore, because now I was the one who got to deliver the verdict. The news spread faster than I expected. By the time I walked out of my courtroom that afternoon, there were 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 from each of my brothers, and 1 shaky voicemail that started with "What the hell is going on?" and ended with a string of half-choked sobs. I didn't listen to the rest. I didn't need to. I already knew what had shattered their reality. It wasn't my father's health. It was the fact that, for the first time in their lives, they weren't in control of the situation. I was. By nightfall, my mother's tone had shifted from confusion to command. "Call me back," her text read. "They're not letting us make decisions. They said you signed something. Fix this." Like I'd made some kind of clerical error in her world order, as if I'd accidentally stolen power that had always belonged to her. But this wasn't an accident. This was the result of years of being ignored until someone needed my calm, my logic, my signature. They didn't mind my intelligence when it came with silence, but now that it came with authority, they were scrambling to understand how it happened. I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I knew they didn't ask out of concern. They weren't calling to check on me or even to ask about my father. They were calling because they were scared, and scared people look for someone to blame. The next morning, I drove to the hospital. No fanfare, no theatrics. I wore my robe over my arm, not to be dramatic, but because I was heading to chambers afterward. As I stepped into the building, I saw my brothers pacing the lobby, their faces twisted when they saw me. Shock, resentment, and something else they'd never aimed at me before, uncertainty. "Why didn't you tell us?" my younger brother snapped. "Why are you the one in charge?" My mother stood beside him, arms crossed like she was preparing a closing argument. I looked each of them in the eye and said, "Because he asked me, because I was the only one who didn't treat him like a burden when he was scared." Their silence was the first honest thing they'd given me in years. I didn't stay long. I met with the doctor, reviewed the options, signed the necessary papers. My father was stable, but unconscious. The kind of stillness that makes you think about everything you never said and everything you did. As I stood by his bedside, I thought about all the times he made me feel small, and how, even in that hospital room, with machines keeping him alive, he still had more power over their emotions than he ever had over mine. They thought I was nothing, a footnote, an afterthought. But now the illusion was broken, and all they could do was sit there, helpless, while I made the decisions they thought they'd never have to trust me with. He looked smaller than I remembered. My father, the man who once towered over dinner tables and cut conversations in half with a glare, now lay still beneath sterile sheets and blinking monitors. His skin looked fragile. His chest rose and fell in uneven waves. Machines hummed where his voice used to dominate. And I stood at his bedside, not as a daughter desperate for approval, but as a legal authority the hospital couldn't bypass. That shift didn't feel triumphant, it felt sobering. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year when the hospital called. Our last conversation was short, condescending. He told me I was wasting my time in law, that the real world wasn't impressed with titles on paper. He said it with a smirk, like he knew something I didn't. But here we were. Titles on paper were the only reason anyone had to talk to me now. And I hadn't had to raise my voice once. The doctor explained everything in clinical, practiced language. My father had suffered a cardiac episode. The situation was serious, but manageable. They needed permission for a procedure, a choice that came with risk, a choice only I could make. I reviewed the documents with the same precision I used in chambers. I asked questions they weren't expecting, legal nuances about consent and risk disclosure. The doctor blinked and adjusted his tone. He started calling me Judge Monroe instead of Miss Monroe. My mother heard it from the hallway and flinched like someone had slapped her. Later, in the waiting room, she cornered me. Her face was tight, her voice sharper than grief allowed. I don't understand how you ended up with power of attorney. Your brothers should be the ones making these decisions. They're his sons. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I just said, he gave it to me. She scoffed, like I was speaking a language she refused to learn. He was probably confused. That paperwork was years ago. He didn't know what he was signing. Maybe, I said. But it's legally binding, and whether he meant to or not, he made me the one in charge, and that means you're not. She looked at me like I'd betrayed her. But the betrayal she felt wasn't mine. It was her own reflection. It was the realization that the child they ignored had become the adult with the final say. My brothers sat in awkward silence. They didn't argue. Maybe they thought this was temporary. Maybe they assumed they could still talk their way back into control. But this wasn't about control anymore. It was about consequence. For the first time in our lives, I didn't need anything from them. Not approval, not permission, not even acknowledgement. The man in the bed used to decide everything in our house. Now his life depended on a signature, and the hand holding the pen was mine. I stayed at the hospital longer than I needed to, not out of obligation, those days were gone, but because I wanted to see if the weight of the moment would finally settle in for them. My mother paced the corner of the waiting room like she was rehearsing a script. My brothers kept staring at the floor, chewing invisible arguments behind tight jaws. None of them looked at me directly. They couldn't. Not after hearing doctors and nurses call me Judge Monroe like it was the only name that mattered. When the nurse walked over to update us on the surgery I had approved, she stood in front of me first. "Your father is stable," she said, addressing no one else. "The procedure went well. He's resting now. Do you have any specific post-op instructions you'd like us to follow, Judge?" I caught the flicker of my mother's eye, the twitch in her lip when the title landed. My younger brother cleared his throat like he was about to say something, but I beat him to it. "Keep me informed directly," I said. "The family will coordinate through me." It wasn't a power trip. It was a boundary. One they'd never expected me to set, let alone enforce without anger. That was what really got to them, I think. The fact that I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to justify. I had facts, signatures, legal backing, and a calm they couldn't shake. They tried to break the silence on the drive back to the parking garage. My older brother muttered, "You could have at least told us you were a judge." I kept walking. "Would it have made a difference?" I asked without turning. "Would you have believed me if I had?" No response, just the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me and the creak of guilt setting in. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in front of the framed law degree that hung over my bookshelf. It had never felt like a weapon before, but tonight it had. Not because I'd used it to hurt them, but because it was undeniable proof that I'd built something none of them could diminish anymore. My phone buzzed. A text from my mom. "He's asking for you. Just you." I stared at the screen. For a moment, something inside me softened. Then I remembered all the birthdays spent in silence, all the dinners where my accomplishments were met with shrugs, all the years they told me I'd never be enough. Now I was the only one he trusted when he couldn't even speak. Funny how quickly silence turns to reverence when your name becomes the gate between life and death. They used to say I was invisible. Now they couldn't move without me. The next morning, I walked into the hospital room alone. No brothers, no mother, just the click of my heels against the linoleum floor and the low hum of machines standing guard. My father lay there, eyes closed, face pale, but breathing steadily. I stood at the foot of the bed and waited, not out of patience, but out of intention. I wanted my presence to register before my voice did. I wanted him to feel the shift before he even opened his eyes. Then, slowly, they blinked open. He looked around, groggy, confused. His eyes landed on me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I never expected reflected back. Uncertainty, not disappointment, not disdain, just a quiet, dawning awareness that he didn't know who I was anymore, and that terrified him. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I stepped closer and placed the call button in his hand. "You don't need to talk," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Just listen." He didn't nod, didn't blink, but he didn't look away either. "I approved your surgery, signed the papers, gave the doctors permission. Not Mom, not the boys, me." I watched the flicker of realization ripple across his face. "You gave me that power years ago. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you never thought it would come to this, but here we are." His fingers twitched around the call button. I could tell he wanted to interrupt, but he couldn't, not physically, not emotionally. "I've built a life you never saw coming," I continued. "A courtroom with my name on the bench, a team that respects me, people who don't laugh when I speak. I didn't need your approval to get there, but I would have loved your support." His eyes widened slightly, and something behind them crumbled, like the scaffolding of pride was finally buckling under the truth. The monitors beeped softly, steady but quick. "Don't worry," I said, softer now. "I'm not here for revenge. I didn't come to punish you. I came because despite everything, I still believe in doing what's right. You're alive because I honored that belief, not because I owed you anything." I stepped back and pulled out a small envelope from my bag. Inside was a letter, typed and signed, formally transferring power of attorney to my mother. She hadn't earned it, but I was done being the gatekeeper. I had nothing left to prove. "I'll have the hospital file this today. I'm releasing that responsibility. You're stable now, and you'll be fine." I placed the envelope on the tray beside his bed and met his eyes one last time. "But let's be clear. You don't get access to me without respect, not anymore." And then I walked out. No drama, no tears, just a quiet reversal he'd never seen coming from the daughter he thought would never have the last word. But I already had. And now I didn't need to say anything else. The day after I transferred power of attorney, my inbox was flooded. Hospital records, legal confirmations, a message from the ethics liaison at the facility thanking me for handling the transition with grace under pressure. I stared at those words longer than I meant to. Grace under pressure. That used to mean keeping my mouth shut while my family dismissed everything I did. It meant smiling through insults disguised as jokes and letting them stack their egos on my back like bricks. But not anymore. Now it meant boundaries wrapped in calm. Decisions made with precision, walking away from power, not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't need to prove I deserved it. That afternoon, I sat back in my judge's chair, the bench cold but solid beneath me. My robe was crisp, the courtroom silent. The bailiff gave me a nod as the next case was called. Two attorneys stepped forward, one clearly newer, nervous, the other seasoned and smug. They didn't know my story. They didn't need to. All they saw was the woman in the chair at the top of the room, whose voice determined outcomes. A woman who couldn't be talked over, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be laughed out of the room. I didn't flinch when I rendered judgment, didn't hesitate when I signed the order. That seat didn't ask for permission, it didn't need applause, it just held space for the truth. And I'd finally become someone who did the same for herself. Later that week, my older brother called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice cracked halfway through the message. "We didn't know how far you'd come," he said. "I guess we just didn't see it." That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him. Not acknowledgement, not accountability, just stunned confusion that I had grown into something they never expected. I deleted the voicemail. The following Sunday, my mother showed up at my door uninvited. I didn't open it, just stood there behind the locked wood, listening as she knocked twice, then 3 times, then whispered, "You really won't let me in?" I didn't reply, because that was the point. My whole life, I'd been expected to give them access to my time, my achievements, my silence. They thought being family meant having a key to everything I was. But now, even the door was a boundary they couldn't cross without permission. Inside, I poured a cup of coffee and sat by my window. The same girl who used to shrink at the dinner table had built a room no one could dismiss her from. I didn't need their applause. I had my own respect now. And in the end, that was the seat of power they would never be able to touch. Not with a knock, not with regret, not even with blood. The memory played on a loop in my head like a movie I never asked to star in. That family dinner, the one where it all began. The table had been set like any other Sunday night, polished silverware, overcooked roast, and undercooked compassion. My brothers had taken turns mocking my job prospects between mouthfuls of food, tossing words like wannabe lawyer and courtroom princess across the table like they were harmless jokes. My father, the king of punchlines, had leaned back in his chair, sipped his whiskey, and said, "Let's be honest, you'll always be the kid who talks big and delivers small." They'd all laughed, except me. I hadn't flinched then, just kept cutting my meat while they carved into my ambition. Because back then I didn't need them to see me, I just needed time. Now, years later, those same voices were quieter, desperate, less sure of themselves, because the sister they used to mock now had the authority they couldn't navigate without. The girl they dismissed was now the woman with the credentials, the courtroom, and the pen that finalized their outcomes. And suddenly, their jokes weren't so funny anymore. When the hospital redirected a request to me for Dad's insurance documentation, something none of them knew how to access, I got 3 calls in 5 minutes. My younger brother left a message that started with, "Hey sis," like we'd been close since birth, like he hadn't once called me Judge Judy with a chip on her shoulder. My mother followed up with a text, "We need your help, again, please." I stared at it for a while. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I finally had the power to decide how to respond. And that was a kind of silence they'd never learned to sit in. I didn't respond right away. I let them wait, let them wonder, because I knew exactly what that dinner had meant to them. It was their victory lap, their chance to remind me where I stood. And they were so sure I'd never rise above the jokes, they never imagined I'd outgrow the whole table. Now, every favor they asked felt like a punchline they had to choke on. And the irony, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to belittle them or throw their words back in their faces. The weight of their past laughter was already doing that work for me. I eventually sent the documents, not out of obligation, but because I chose to. That's the part they'll never understand. Power isn't just about saying no. Sometimes real power is in choosing when and how to say yes, and letting the silence afterward say everything they refused to hear before. So now when they sit around that same dinner table, I hope they feel it. The absence of someone they used to laugh at. The presence of someone they now have to ask for help. Not so funny now, is it? Every medical decision passed through me. Legally, emotionally, practically. They might have shared his last name, but I held the signature that counted. The signed orders bore my name, Judge Monroe, in crisp black ink. Each time the hospital called, it wasn't my mother or my brothers they reached out to, it was me. And I never once reminded them why. I didn't need to. The silence on their end whenever I answered those calls was reminder enough. It started with the minor updates, medication changes, physical therapy evaluations. Then it became bigger. Surgery authorizations, specialist referrals, discharge planning. Each decision carried weight. Each required judgment. Mine. And though I made those choices with professionalism, with the same impartial clarity I brought to my courtroom, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the shift in power with every form I signed, not as payback, but as proof. My mother tried to insert herself again during a care planning meeting. She showed up uninvited, sat across from the care coordinator, and spoke first. As his wife, I think we should consider. The coordinator cut her off gently, glancing at me. Actually, all medical decisions must be authorized by Judge Monroe. We can take notes, but final consent must come from her. My mother's face flushed a dull, mottled red, her lips pressed into a line so thin it looked like it could disappear. And in that silence, I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, calm and collected, and said, "We'll proceed with option 2. My older brother pulled me aside in the hallway afterward. "You know this is making things worse, right?" he hissed. "You're humiliating Mom." I looked him dead in the eyes. "No, you all did that years ago. I'm just here doing my job." And then I walked away, because no matter how uncomfortable they felt seeing me in control, it couldn't compare to the years I spent biting my tongue while they tore down my ambition one dinner at a time. Later that week, the social worker called me to finalize Dad's rehabilitation plan. She needed approval to transfer him to a facility for long-term recovery. She asked if the family had preferences. I paused, thought of all the times they made me feel like I was nothing. Then I answered clearly, "No preferences from them. I'll review the options and choose the best one myself." She didn't question it, because legally she couldn't, and emotionally I wouldn't let her. Each time I signed my name beneath the line labeled Authorized Representative, I felt the weight of my own history settle just a little lighter on my shoulders. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about reclaiming the version of myself they tried to erase, the one who dared to dream bigger than their expectations. Now my name wasn't just in their mouths. It was on every line that mattered. I didn't make them wait out of spite. That would have been easy. That would have been petty. Spite is reactive, a flash in the pan, a middle finger you wave when you're still wounded. No, I made them wait out of something colder, sharper. Clarity. Because when the fog finally lifted, when I stood there holding legal authority in one hand and memories of their laughter in the other, I understood something I couldn't when I was younger. You don't owe rescue to the people who built the fire and left you in it. Clarity is what stopped me from answering every text the moment it arrived, from replying to every voicemail laced with false urgency. It's what held my hand still when my mother's message came in. "Please, your father needs you. It's an emergency." I'd seen that script before. I knew the way her words were meant to wrap around my spine and pull me back into obedience. But I also knew this wasn't about a medical crisis. This was about control slipping through her fingers like water. Clarity is why I returned hospital calls before I returned theirs. Because the hospital respected my title, my role, my judgment. They asked, "Judge Monroe, how would you like to proceed?" Not, "Are you sure you're qualified?" or "Shouldn't a man decide this?" The hospital didn't remember me as the girl who forgot to bring dessert to Thanksgiving, or the one who talked too much at dinner. They saw me now, not as an extension of someone else, but as the decision maker, the one in charge. That kind of respect is earned, not begged for. When my brothers finally cornered me in the hospital cafeteria, I let them talk. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. They tried every approach: guilt, reason, nostalgia. "Come on, you're the smart one," my younger brother said, half laughing, half pleading. "We've always known that." I almost choked on my coffee. Now they remembered? Now I was the smart one? Back then, I was too emotional to be taken seriously. Now I was the only one who could fix this. The irony tasted bitter, but I didn't let it show. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said, setting my cup down. "I did it because I needed time to think, to decide what was actually mine to carry and what wasn't." My older brother frowned. "So you're punishing us?" I looked him dead in the eye. "No. I'm choosing myself. That's not punishment. That's survival." The truth is, once I saw the pattern for what it was, dismissal, manipulation, entitlement, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't keep playing the role of the forgiving daughter, the always available sister, the fixer, not for people who only reached out when they were falling apart, not for people who only valued me when I became useful. I made them wait. Not because I was angry, but because I finally knew I didn't have to rush to prove my worth. And that, more than anything, was the clearest decision I'd ever made. They realized it slowly, first in confusion, then in disbelief, and finally in silence. The kind of silence that settles heavy at the base of your throat when you know the room you once ruled no longer belongs to you. That's what it felt like the moment my family understood I held the pen now. Not just the physical one that signed medical orders or legal directives, but the symbolic one, the one that writes the ending, the one they never thought I'd be strong enough to hold. The shift happened without warning, or maybe it had been happening all along and they just never noticed. My father, from his hospital bed, didn't argue when the discharge papers were handed to me instead of him. He didn't say a word when the doctor called me into the hallway to explain next steps, bypassing the rest like they weren't even there. My mother, always quick to fill the silence with authority she hadn't earned, stopped correcting the nurses when they asked for Judge Monroe. Even she understood now, begrudgingly, that the title wasn't just for show. My brothers tried to mask their discomfort with jokes that didn't land. "Guess we should have listened to you more at dinner, huh?" one of them muttered under his breath. I didn't respond. What was there to say? They were being forced to watch the rerun of every moment they dismissed me, and now the screen was stuck on repeat. This was their consequence. To sit in rooms they used to control, knowing their opinions were now background noise. One afternoon, during a care team meeting, the attending physician asked who had final say on Dad's rehab facility. All eyes turned to me. My mother, sitting directly across the table, opened her mouth to speak but paused. She looked at the clipboard in front of her like it might give her back the power she lost. "You can ask her," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "She'll decide." I nodded once. And in that tiny moment, I felt it, the quiet unraveling of the old hierarchy, thread by thread. They hated sitting in it, hated that I didn't gloat, that I didn't lash out, that I didn't remind them every second of who had the final word now. Because what unnerved them most wasn't my authority. It was my calm. I had nothing to prove anymore. No need for validation. I was done performing for their approval. And that quiet confidence, that terrified them more than any outburst ever could. So they sat with it, with the reality that the daughter they once overlooked now wrote the script, that the punchline was gone, that the judge wasn't just in the courtroom, she was in the family now, and this time she wasn't asking for a seat at the table, she was deciding who got to stay in the room. You don't get to disrespect someone and expect their help later. That's the sentence I kept coming back to, like a mantra I whispered between phone calls and signature lines. It echoed louder each time they looked at me like I owed them something. Like every cruel word they tossed across the dinner table was supposed to dissolve under the weight of family ties. But what they didn't understand, what they never wanted to understand, is that respect isn't a switch you flip when you need something. It's a foundation you build over time, and they never laid a single brick. For years, I thought staying quiet was how you earned respect, that if I worked harder, proved myself, climbed higher, they'd eventually see me. But the higher I climbed, the more they tried to clip my wings. Now, standing above the wreckage of their assumptions, I finally understood that respect wasn't about waiting for someone else to give it. It was about refusing to give away your dignity just to feel included. That became clear the day the social worker mentioned a family financial contribution might expedite Dad's long-term care approval. The room went quiet. My mother stared at her lap. My older brother cleared his throat and gave me that sideways glance I knew too well. The same one he used to give when pushing a check across the table with a smirk, expecting me to pick up the tab. "You're the only one who really has the means," he said carefully, like it was a compliment. "And you're the one with all the access." I tilted my head. "You mean the job you said was a waste of time? The education you told me was a phase? Or the courtroom you all laughed at until I held the gavel?" He flinched, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'd learned that silence is sometimes the loudest boundary you can draw. They didn't ask again, not because they suddenly respected me, but because they finally realized I wasn't the same girl who would bend under guilt or obligation. That version of me had retired, and in her place stood someone who knew that help without respect isn't compassion, it's manipulation. I didn't pay a cent. I also didn't explain myself. I let them sit in their discomfort. I let them reckon with the fact that the daughter they mocked had become someone they needed. And instead of stepping in to save them, I stood still, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because real respect isn't built in emergencies. It's proven in the quiet moments when no one's watching. So when they finally stopped asking, I knew I'd taught them something. Not about money, not about power, but about value. Mine. And I didn't need their acknowledgement to feel it anymore. I'd already redefined what respect means, and for the first time, I was the one who decided what that word was worth. It happened in the most ordinary way. No dramatic music, no spotlight, no tearful intervention. Just a quiet afternoon, a hospital room filled with the low hum of machines and the rustle of papers being signed. I was reviewing Dad's discharge summary when I heard it. My mother's voice, thin and cracked like the porcelain teacups she used to collect, barely above a whisper. "We're proud of you." I didn't look up right away. My pen paused mid-signature, but my face didn't move. Not because I didn't hear it, but because I finally didn't need to. The words that I used to fantasize about, beg for in silence, twist myself into 1,000 versions of perfect to earn, had arrived too late. They floated there between us like a balloon released too long after the party ended. Hollow, decorative, unnecessary. Proud. Proud of what, exactly? Of surviving their mockery, of becoming the success they used to laugh at, of doing what they refused to believe I was capable of, maybe. Or maybe they were proud because now, finally, they saw the benefits of my strength. But pride offered in hindsight, after years of erasure, isn't pride. It's regret in a prettier dress. I set the pen down and finally met her eyes. There was no anger left, no fire, just something colder, wiser. "You don't get to rewrite the past," I said softly. "I made peace with the silence a long time ago." She opened her mouth to speak again, maybe to explain, maybe to backtrack, but I didn't give her the chance. "I didn't build this life for your approval, and I'm not handing over what I've earned just because you've decided to change the story now." My father stirred in his bed, half lucid. He blinked slowly and murmured something about the judge being there. I stood up. "I'll coordinate the transportation team," I said to the nurse, who nodded and followed me out. As the door closed behind me, I felt a strange peace settle in. Not because they'd finally said the words, but because I no longer needed them. That was the real shift. The moment everything changed wasn't when they saw my worth, it was when I stopped waiting for them to. And by then, I had already written a better ending, one where their words, whether spoken or not, no longer held power over mine. I stood outside the hospital that final afternoon, the late sun casting long shadows across the pavement, and realized I didn't feel victorious. I felt free, lighter, not because I had won some argument, but because I had let go of the need to be seen by people who were never looking in the first place. They called me nothing once. At that dinner, surrounded by relatives and wine glasses and half-swallowed smirks, they said it with the kind of certainty only ignorance provides. But they were wrong. I wasn't nothing. I never was. The truth is, I spent years trying to hand them the evidence of my worth, grades, degrees, promotions, success stacked like a closing argument in court. I built case after case, hoping they'd one day reach the obvious conclusion. But people don't see what they're not willing to. They couldn't see me because they didn't want to. It threatened the story they'd written, the one where I was always less than, always reaching. So eventually, I stopped trying to fit their version of me, and I became my own. When the doctors called me judge, it wasn't just a title, it was recognition. From people who hadn't seen the girl I used to be, only the woman I had become. That's what made it powerful. That's what made it real. Because it wasn't conditional, it wasn't offered with strings or sarcasm, it was just mine. That dinner replayed in my head one last time. The laughter, the rolled eyes, the moment my father leaned in and said, "You really think you're something, don't you?" I had swallowed the shame back then, smiled through the sting. But now, standing on the other side of everything they said I couldn't be, I finally had my answer. Yes, I do. The verdict had been delivered long before they realized it. In every late night I studied alone. In every courtroom I walked into with my head held high. In every decision I made with a spine they tried to break. They called me nothing. But that label didn't stick, because the truth is, I was never asking for their permission, and I don't need their validation to stand in my own authority. The last time I saw my family, we weren't around a dinner table. We were in a courtroom. My father needed a signature for an estate matter, something routine, something he assumed I'd just sign like old times. He called me by my first name at first, casual, like we were equals. But when the clerk addressed me as Your Honor, he flinched. That's when it hit him. I wasn't the girl he used to dismiss. I was the one with the authority to decide. His eyes dropped, mine didn't. That was the power reversal. Not revenge, just reality. The same girl they once told would never be anything was now the legal authority they couldn't move forward without. Not because I demanded respect, but because I earned it somewhere they never thought to look, outside their approval. And I know I'm not alone. Since sharing parts of my story online, I've heard from hundreds, yes, hundreds of people who were labeled too much, too quiet, too emotional, or just flat out not enough. People who were underestimated by the very families meant to uplift them, people who turned that silence into strength. So if you've ever been called nothing by the people who should have known better, hear me now. You are not the names they gave you. You are not their projection or their resentment. You are the author of your own story. You hold the pen. And when they finally see you for who you are, when they finally say the words you waited so long to hear, you'll already be too full to need them, too whole to shrink back down, too far ahead to look over your shoulder. This story may have ended, but the message lingers. For more raw and real moments like this, click on the left and subscribe to walk alongside more women finding their strength. And remember, your silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you're saving your voice for the final word.